Hi, it's Mr. Ensrud, and today we're going to learn about microevolution. So to start, we're going to discuss allele frequency and what an allele frequency is. So an allele frequency refers to the relative amounts of alleles within a population's gene pool. So here we have a population of birds. Some of the birds are red, and some of the birds are blue. The red bird is the dominant color, and the blue is the recessive. So about 60% of the birds are red, and about 40% are blue. But we know that some of the red birds are going to carry the recessive allele. They're going to be heterozygous. So when we look at their genotypes, about 16% of the birds are homozygous dominant. About 44% of the birds are heterozygous, carrying one dominant and one recessive allele. And about 40% of the birds are homozygous recessive, which matches our blue-colored bird, because the only way to be blue is to be homozygous recessive. So those two numbers should match up. But if we look now at just the frequency of the alleles, if we look at how many dominant alleles are in this gene pool, well, it's only 38% compared to 62% of the recessive allele. Now that might seem a little counterintuitive. We have 60% red birds, but only 30% carrying the recessive, the red allele, the dominant allele. So, this question, there were some people that disagreed with Mendelian genetics, and one of the reasons they disagreed with it, and this was in the early 1900s, was because they thought that a dominant allele should really, over time, make the recessive alleles disappear. So they thought that over time, recessive alleles would go away because dominant overshadows them, and the dominant allele would dominate. So this problem was presented to a British mathematician named G.H. Hardy. And Hardy and Wienberg looked at the problem from a mathematical point of view. And what they determined was that allele frequencies will actually remain constant in a population unless there are evolutionary influences that act on the population. So unless there's some kind of external forces causing the population to change, the allele frequencies will stay the same. And we call this genetic equilibrium. Genetic equilibrium just means that the allele frequencies will remain constant from one generation to the next. Again, unless something externally influences those populations. So the Hardy-Wienberg principle says that allele frequencies will remain in equilibrium unless acted upon by evolutionary influences. So that is what microevolution is all about. It's any change in allele frequencies in the gene pool of a population. So what were those evolutionary influences that Hardy and Wienberg were talking about? Well, those are things like mutation and natural selection and non-random mating, also known as sexual selection, genetic drift, and gene flow. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to define these different types of microevolution. So we'll start with mutation. So most of you are probably pretty familiar with mutations. What is a mutation? Well, it's a change in your genetic sequence. Now, most mutations are harmful. Some mutations lead to cancer. Other mutations cause cells to destroy themselves. That's called apoptosis. But every once in a while, a mutation can be okay. It can be all right and maybe cause a change in a phenotype or the way something looks. And sometimes those change in phenotypes can be beneficial. And that can allow an organism to outcompete other organisms or be more fit. And that leads us to natural selection. So we've talked about natural selection already. Natural selection is the driving force of evolution. So it drives evolution by selecting traits that make an organism more likely to survive and to reproduce. And that's really the key idea. They have to reproduce in an environment to make more offspring with that similar trait. But what determines whether a trait is beneficial or not really depends on the environment. So think of the rock pocket mouse. The light-colored mouse on the sandy soil was beneficial. But on a dark-colored background, that light coloration was detrimental to the mouse, and the owls could pick them off. When the soil is covered with black lava rock, all of a sudden this dark colored mouse now becomes the beneficial trait. So the environment determines fitness. So now we're going to talk about different types of natural selection. There's really three different things that can happen in natural selection. First is called stabilizing selection, and this is where the group in the middle, if we look at every organism in a population, it's the group with the median version of a trait, the one in the middle, that is the most fit. And so this kind of makes a population or a graph of a population become a little narrower and taller, and those on the extremes are less fit, and so they usually don't survive to pass on their traits. The next type of selection is called directional selection. Directional selection favors one extreme over another. So this will actually shift a population one direction or another. It could shift a color, or it could shift the size of a beak, for example, in the finches that Darwin observed. And the third type of selection is called disruptive selection. And disruptive selection is where both the high and low extremes are more beneficial than the middle. And so what this tends to do is create gaps in these groups and create groups with different characteristics, and eventually these can lead to new species called speciation. Okay, now we're going to talk about a type of microevolution called genetic drift. So genetic drift is any change in allele frequencies that are caused by random chance. Larger populations are going to be less affected because it's less likely that random chance will change those allele frequencies. But here's an example, a population of birds, and oh no, a big boulder landed on these birds, wiped out a bunch of them. And what we have left in that population, and in those birds, their alleles, is our new gene pool. So the gene pool may have shifted. In this case, it doesn't look like it shifted too much because there was nice diversity in those birds. But that is a random change in those allele frequencies. And this can be caused by any type of random event that happens. Another type of genetic drift is called the founder effect. So the founder effect is when a small number of individuals breaks off and starts a new population. So say these bluebirds land on a new island and they start to reproduce. Because they only brought blue alleles with them, all the birds on the island now are going to have those alleles, and so they're all going to be blue. So this new population has a completely different allele frequency than the original population. Another type of genetic drift is called the bottleneck effect. So bottleneck is when there's a drastic reduction in population size. This can be caused by any type of extreme selective force like disease, famine, drought. So let's say in this population, a big storm comes in and blows away a bunch of birds. What we have left and the alleles that those birds have with them is the new gene pool. And so we're going to have new allele frequencies because of that storm. Another type of microevolution is called gene flow. So gene flow is the movement of alleles between populations. So here we have two different populations of birds. Population 1 lives on one side of a mountain range. Population 2 lives on the other side. And at some point, one of these birds migrates over the mountain range and starts to breed with the second population. So because this bird brought with it different alleles, this bird's red, that's going to change the allele frequencies and possibly change the phenotypes of future generations. All right, the last type of microevolution is called non-random mating. It's also known as sexual selection. So this happens when mates are determined by phenotypic differences. This is really common in birds, especially birds of paradise. In these birds, the females choose their males based on their exaggerated traits or characteristics. And these characteristics can be coloration, it can be an elaborate song, it could be fancy plumage or feathers, it could be fancy nest building, or even wild and crazy mating dances. So this type of sexual selection was kind of counterintuitive to Charles Darwin. He didn't really understand it because it didn't match up with natural selection. But it's a type of selection that actually exaggerates traits that sometimes aren't beneficial for the birds. for their survival or fitness. All right, so that was microevolution, alleles, allele frequencies, and a little bit of hardy-wienberg. I hope that was helpful.